Firstly, thank you all for coming this evening for some learning and to support this program. This is in a series of 5 events as a collaborative effort of the Hills of Eternity and Sherith Israel. We do have another event here next Wednesday, a week from today, that will focus on comforting and those who are departing. This is, of course, part of life because death is part of life. Our focus this evening is on the difficult decisions that we can face as the end approaches. Do please remember to register if you can so that we can get a count if you're coming to future events. I'm so pleased to be able to introduce those who will be teaching us this evening. Of course, you know our moderator, Rabbi Jessica Graf. And we are also very pleased to join from the religious community, Rabbi Eric Weiss. He is a graduate of UC Santa Cruz and Hebrew Union College, and he's been a central pillar of Bay Area Jewish life. In addition to his work in teaching and pastoral care, Rabbi Weiss has served on the National Board of the Central Conference of American Rabbis, as well as a number of other boards. He has been both president and CEO of the Bay Area Jewish Healing Center, from which he retired in May of 2022. He's currently interim co-director of Shalom Bayit, and his accomplishments, accolades, and contributions to Jewish life are far too numerous to list here, but the impact that he has had is evident in the faces that light up with fondness and appreciation at literally every mention of his name, and he now lives in Palm Springs with his husband, Dan. Helping us to learn from the lay side is Dr. Ann Kinderman. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Dr. Kinderman is a graduate of Rush Medical College and is a palliative care physician and clinical professor of medicine at UCSF. She completed a fellowship in hospice and palliative medicine at Stanford University. Dr. Kinderman currently practices in 2 outpatient palliative care clinics at UCSF and also provides palliative care consultation at the San Francisco campus for Jewish living. For many years, she served as the director of palliative care at San Francisco General Hospital, helping to develop and sustain inpatient, clinic, and educational programs in palliative care. She's also worked for many years to support the expansion of palliative care access to Californians insured with Medicaid. Thank you so much for giving us your time this evening.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Okay, I really don't know where to look. We're 3 years into the pandemic, and I still don't understand these things. So, Rabbi Weiss, can you see me at all?
Yes. Hello, Rabbi Graf.
To you, I don't know where I'm supposed to look, but we're all here, lots of us. And Dr. Kinderman and I are sitting on the sides of you so that the 3 of us are in a row at the front of the room.
Oh, I feel included.
Very included. And we wish you were here in person, but we're thrilled that you're here with us on a screen. Thank you. And thank you for being with us, and to all of you. When Eric and I started, can you hear me? Yeah. Do we need a microphone? No. Okay. When Eric and I started having these conversations about who we might want on these panels, we just sort of started dreaming. Who would be our ideal panelists, and how could we create these topics to really welcome the leaders of our community to share with us their areas of expertise? And we, I think, got every single person that we wanted. We were so delighted, and today we're really thrilled to be able to bring this conversation about end of life from a medical perspective and also from a Jewish spiritual perspective. So just one word of business. This is being recorded, and there are people from literally around the world who have emailed me today to say they're looking forward to watching this video. So I'm very pleased about that. So you all know we've asked Alan to end the recording when we finish with the presentations and begin with personal questions, so people can feel vulnerable yet safe in this space together, knowing who's part of this conversation. So this part is being recorded so that other people can join with us. So I want to ask both of you, by way of sort of beginning this conversation, Doctors and rabbis bring comfort to people at the end of life. Both of you, in your tremendous experience at end of life times, have been with countless people, families, moments of great importance in the lives of humans. And I would really like you to begin, maybe Dr. Kinderman, you'll start. Tell us a little bit, what is it like to be a source of comfort as well as medical information? But what is it like to be a palliative care doctor? How do you help families? What is your role at the end of life? And then Rabbi Weiss, from a different perspective, can answer a similar question.
Yeah. So, one of the ways that I tend to answer this question is, I know nothing about cars other than I put my key in. I still have a key that goes into my ignition, and I turn it on. And then if it's not working, I take it to a mechanic, and the mechanic will say, you have this leak in your O-ring over here, and then just sort of stops with that information. And I don't know what that means because I don't know anything about cars. And what I want to know is my car going to break down on the Bay Bridge and be kind of off to the side of the, is this a big deal? Is it not a big deal? And I kind of think that in some ways that's what we do in medicine unintentionally around these issues, is we sort of go, there's this thing that's changed on your scan or this result, and we sort of go here, and people don't always know what that means or how to respond or how to navigate what comes next. And so I feel like palliative care is certainly anyone, a primary care doctor, an oncologist, a neurologist, anyone can help with those conversations. But palliative care, we really focus in on the communication components, and we also really prioritize not getting lost in the diagnosis and the next treatment and what can we do. The question is really, what should we do? And what should we do is really informed by the individual person and their priorities and their belief system and what matters to them. And so when I have a patient or family that says, well, what would you do if this were your mom or this were your dad? And what I tell them is, my parents are actually quite different people, and they might make different choices in this situation. What the person is generally asking me for in that situation is a recommendation, which is totally fair. And so what I say is, I'm happy to give you a recommendation, but I'm gonna need to ask you some other questions first to find out about what you wanna prioritize. And what kind of how you think about taking risks with different treatments. How much are you willing to go through for the possibility of having more time? And then we can kind of make a plan together for what makes sense. But so that's I think how to provide support around navigating a serious illness or a terminal illness. There's a bunch of other things that I do as a palliative care physician around managing symptoms. Palliate comes from a Latin term for a cloak that you put over, and I sort of think about that as like shielding you from the elements. So it doesn't prevent the rain from happening, it just prevents you from getting soaked, or your kind of experience of it. So we're trying to ease the effects, the stress and the symptoms that come along with a serious illness.
So how would you describe the doctor's role or the palliative care doctor's role at the end of life?
Well, certainly I do a lot of work around, if someone has shortness of breath or they have pain or they have other symptoms. So that's, I think, so palliative care, most people will say it's a team sport. No one person can do all of the things to address suffering in all of the ways that it comes up for people who are dealing with the end of life or a serious illness. And so I've been really privileged to work on teams really my whole career in palliative care, and typically I work with a nurse, a social worker, and a chaplain. There are other times where I'm lucky enough to have a pharmacist, or I don't have one of those other disciplines for a while, but among those, I would say that my unique skill set is really on kind of understanding the symptom and kind of suggesting some treatments to ease discomfort, and then digesting the medical information about what's going on and helping to match up the care plan with that. But certainly, as people are approaching the end of life and I'm having conversations, there are big questions that come up for people, like, how long is this gonna be? Or, I'm really worried that he's not eating and drinking anymore. Like, should we do something different? There are a bunch of things, so it's addressing the questions and concerns that come up for people in addition to those other things.
Nice, thank you so much. So Rabbi Weiss, for decades at the Bay Area Jewish Healing Center and Jewish Hospice, you were helping Jewish people navigate this end of life path. How would you describe the rabbi's role in that? And how would you say you were able to bring comfort to people in that place?
Can I just say it's a joy to be with everybody there and with Rabbi Graf, and it's nice to see you again, Dr. Kinderman. I think that, just dovetailing with what Dr. Kinderman said, I think that a rabbi's role in terms of being a spiritual care provider is helping somebody navigate into the spiritual narrative in many ways, out of the medical narrative and out of the legal narrative. I think that our culture is very, very powerful in asking us to take care of estate planning and asking us to take care of things like a medical power of attorney, both of which are very important. But those are the legal narrative aspects of dying and death, and part of the medical narrative of dying and death. But my experience is that when somebody comes to the end of life, either literally to their deathbed or through the course of an illness that chances are won't have a cure and will bring someone to their last breath, that what becomes really crucial is that we begin to look at the spiritual narrative of one's life. And I think that's the unique role of a rabbi. A lot of people think that you call a rabbi just for the funeral or at the moment of death. And I think it's just really important to say that part of the end of life experience needs to have the spiritual care narrative supported. So I think that's my perspective, and that's where I feel that I have wisdom from the field, is really encouraging people to understand the spiritual care narrative of their life and how they understand then their last breath.
Beautiful. So I'm going to ask you both this question. How do you understand the idea of spiritual narrative at the end of life? It's a little unfair, I know, because I'm asking you as a doctor, and Rabbi Weiss will explain what he did for decades that way, but what's the overlap?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, for me, when I'm introducing, most people that I meet haven't heard of palliative care. So usually my first visit with people starts explaining what that is. And one of the things that I talk about, helping to manage symptoms, I talk about the emotional impact of having a serious illness. And then I say, it brings up big questions for people. Why is this happening to me? How do I continue to find meaning and purpose and joy in my life? And those are spiritual questions. And because people are coming from all different places, I don't label it as such, because I think then people get all sorts of tangents and things in their head and they can't hear it. But people get that question around, why is this happening, and meaning and joy and those things. And I think those are fundamentally, what your spiritual practices are and how you make meaning. So I think that people, how they deal with the worst thing to happen to you ever is an incredibly wide spectrum. And there are some people that I know that take that and they come back to faith after, having not really engaged for decades of life, but it was there, and they come back and start asking questions. And there are some people who kind of say, I am pushing that way to the edge, and I am focusing all of my attention on what's the next scan going to tell me, and what does my oncologist recommend? And that's where my hope is pinned. And, you know, there is no better and worse, but I think that that path is really hard if you kind of continue pushing that away, kind of as Eric was saying, that, you know, this is something, it takes time, that sort of coming to grips with what's going on.
Do you ever get into the spiritual conversations with people as a doctor, or do you just say, call Rabbi Weiss?
I do. Well, if only I don't have Rabbi Weiss on speed dial all the time. I am really fortunate to have worked with chaplains quite a lot in my work, but I will say my spiritual life is very important to me. I come out of a Christian tradition, and I feel like wherever my patients are coming from, that kind of does inform how, you know, I think about the big questions and the big picture and how I make sense of the world, and so that definitely informs. And I think there are times, you know, they sort of talk about, my background is in general internal medicine, where you're sort of the jack of all trades in some ways, but you know when to call a specialist to say, you know, I know how to in some ways diagnose a kidney problem, but I don't do dialysis on people. So it's not dissimilar with spiritual issues. So for me, I would sort of not be doing my job well if I didn't know how to ask people about how they're dealing with these questions about meaning and purpose and joy. But if it's going to be a deep dive into that, or I feel like there's existential or spiritual distress, I'm going to call in the cavalry. Yeah.
Rabbi Weiss, you are one of, I mean, the Jewish community's revered experts on this conversation about spiritual narrative at the end of life. I mean, I'm sure there are others, but I don't know any other rabbis who have spent as much time with people at the very end of life, probably over a career as you have. Can you tell us, what does that term mean to you? What is that role? What is the spiritual narrative at the end of life?
Sure. Yeah. So if it's okay, let me maybe jump into it in this way, because I think it's very personal and vulnerable and relational. So let me just say, as I see it, most of us in the whole world, let's say just together in this room, most of us know ourselves or other people best when we are well and happy. On a vacation, go out to dinner, just kind of schmooze, etc. The truth of the matter is that when we become sick, and certainly when we come to the end of life, the truth is that most of us do not know ourselves very well, nor do we even know our loved ones very well ill. And so when we come to the end of life, we get a diagnosis that is in some ways terminal or challenging. The truth is that suddenly it's as if we're in a foreign country without a tour guide. We don't know the language. We don't even have the currency for exchange of commerce. And so when we get sick, and certainly when we come to the end of life, part of the conundrum is that we are stuck getting to know ourselves at the same time that we have to understand a whole lot about ourselves quickly. And part of the spiritual narrative is our spirituality gives us a wellspring for coming to understand ourselves and others when we are sick. So if we were to go around the room, which we're not going to do, and we were to all share one thing that attracts us spiritually, one thing that is spiritual for us, one thing that is spiritual for us, and if we were to also explain whatever that one thing was, what about that one thing makes it spiritual for us, if we all went around the room, chances are most of us would say that something that is spiritual for us has something to do with nature, being outside in nature at the beach or going on a hike. And then from there, we would talk about other things that are spiritual for us, like music, going to the opera, going to synagogue and listening to the cantor, or something relational, like being at synagogue and enjoying each other at the oneg. All these different things that are spiritual for us. Now, I have no research except from my own kind of experience in the field, but most people in the world experience spirituality in nature and then in music and other things like that. When we talk about what gives us nourishment spiritually, whatever language we use, when we're taking a hike, when we're at the ocean, when we're listening to music, when we're in synagogue, most of that language comes down to a sense that you recognize there is something at work in the world beyond yourself, a sense of awe, A-W-E. So at the core of coming to understand how we move through being sick and move through dying has a lot to do with the ways in which we are nourished by the experience of awe, A-W-E, the ways in which we interact with what is beyond ourselves, something transcendent. That might be God, that might be something else, that might be, I want to make sure my grandchild understands X, Y, and Z. I want to make sure my so-and-so person really loves me. It might take a lot of different forms. But that is part of how I understand the task of understanding spirituality and the spiritual narrative at the end of life. And I want to end just this one question, Rabbi Graf, with one last comment. It's a little counter-cultural, but I think it's real. And I think in a conversation like this one, it's important to be vulnerable and true to what is true to dying. I think it's important to sort of talk about some of these issues in a very concrete way. So I want to tell you a little story, and it's a story you know. It's a story of the Exodus. So we just finished Passover. We're in the midst of the Omer. We're coming into Shavuot in another couple of weeks. But you know in the Passover Haggadah, where it says, if a child asks you why you do this, you are to say to that child, we do this because I was a slave in Egypt, and God took me out of Egypt with an outstretched arm into freedom. You all remember that part of the Haggadah? Okay. So this is what I want to suggest to you as a way of understanding the spiritual narrative of what I have seen from the field. If really you, if all of us retroject ourselves back into history as a child of Israel in that moment, the truth of the matter is you don't know the end of your own story. We have the Haggadah, we have a story, and we use it in lots and lots of different ways. What does it mean to part through a Red Sea? What does it mean to have manna from heaven? What is Dayenu? What is a modern day plague? What does it mean to covenant? All those very, very important things that are theologically significant in the context of understanding Jewish identity development and the ways that we can use those templates for our lives and apply them to our lives. But on a spiritual level, what I want to say is the true core story of the Exodus and the true core story of Passover is the spiritual truth that nobody but nobody knows the end of their own story. And so if you were a child of Israel then, really all you did was take a leap of faith. You just said yes. You said yes to Moses. You said yes because your neighbor was going the way some of us join a synagogue. My neighbor belongs to Sherith Israel, so I'm going to join Sherith Israel, right? So you said yes because your neighbor went. You said yes because you didn't think that it was good to stay where you were, and you took one step in front of the other and you went forward. The truth of the matter is, and this is where it's a little counter-cultural to what the world teaches us about end of life. I want to posit to you that the true spiritual task through life spiritually and at the end of life is coming to understand the capacity to take leaps of faith and understand your own landscape of awe. A lot of people die without knowing the meaning of something because some people are so curious that they continually leap from purpose to purpose and meaning making to meaning making. So the consequence of a spiritual life and the consequence of taking leaps of faith might be that we come to a sense of purpose, and might be that we land on places of meaning. But those are the consequence of developing the capacity to take leaps of faith. So the core spiritual task, especially when we get sick and get to know ourselves in a different way, is to cultivate the capacity to take leaps of faith and to understand the places in your life where you experience awe. And that is what helps us to understand the different ways in which we need to make decisions about how we want to die.
Wow. So, so I want to expand that question to include the medical, for both of you, but the medical piece as well. So in order to come to understand ourselves at a new time in our lives, towards the end of life, when things come up that we might not have even known that we would feel in the world or feel about ourselves, what should we be thinking about? What questions do we need to ask ourselves to be able to make the kinds of decisions that we would have to make from a medical perspective, or to arrive at this place of awe? What does the end of life kind of uniquely provide in terms of getting to know ourselves to be able to make the right decisions that are so personal?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a big question. I mean, I think that there is a way in which those questions really get buried underneath the what does my blood test show, like, because it's something that's like right on the surface and you can know about it, or you can Google about that, medication or whatever, that kind of thing. And I think that takes a lot of time and energy for people, like that, just keeping up with what's going on in this medication. It's exhausting, all of the, especially if you're tired, you're feeling unwell, maybe you're lucky enough to have a caregiver, someone who's helping you, and that becomes overwhelming for them sometimes too. So I think, what I tried to get at is sort of what are the things that are really important to you in life? What are we doing these things for? It is, for a lot of people around, trying to live longer, trying to get more time. What are we trying to get time for? And for some people, they will say kind of what becomes revealed is that life is precious to me, and even if I can't communicate, if I can't kind of think clearly or interact with the world, that's still alive, and that I still want to live in a condition like that. That's not the majority of people. The majority of people kind of really highly prioritize that, being able to interact with the world and to maybe have some sense of independence or control over things. And so getting a sense of, for some people, it's like I have a patient right now whose child is expecting next month, and so it's like, I really want to be at the baby shower. I really want to see this child being born. And so it's those sorts of things that we focus on and say, like, what can we do to optimize those important priorities and goals, and not just lowering, my blood levels of this thing that, marks my cancer, or that sort of thing. And I think, and it may be that because when someone comes to Rabbi Weiss, there's, a different lens that their approach, when they are talking to me, it's much more around the medical stuff. But we try to bring it out to the big picture and what your priorities are in life.
Are there questions, do you think, that everybody should ask themselves to be able to arrive at those answers? Are there questions that we all need to put forefront in our minds to be able to make the decisions properly?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think like the most important thing that I could say for people in planning ahead is who are the people who are going to support you in decision making? Who are the people that you trust who are going to be alongside? Or if there were a time you couldn't make decisions for yourself, who would that be? Who would you want the doctors to turn to? That is, like, for me as a physician, is the number one thing to kind of be clear about. When it comes to your values, I think those things, number one, I would just have the expectation that things look different when death is a hypothetical thing that's decades away maybe, versus if it's right here. And so expect, and that's okay, that your ideas of what your priorities are change, like that you'll have to rethink that as time goes on. But it's good to think about now, you know, how do I balance the length of my life versus the quality of my life? What are the critical abilities and activities that make my life good? That if I couldn't be doing them, that wouldn't be a good life for me. And, you know, sort of say, like, what I tell my patients is that kind of one of the first precepts of kind of medical ethics is do no harm. And I think that there are times, because of the amazing technology that we have, that we can trap people in an existence that they wouldn't have wanted to live in. And so, you know, those are the things that I want to avoid, to kind of think ahead about, and then just have the expectation that you may feel differently about it.
Rabbi Weiss, what do you think are the questions we need to ask ourselves to understand how we want to die or how we want to live out our lives?
You know, I think the single core question that's really important to ask yourself and to have conversation about and to contemplate is just the simple question of, what do I want my last breath to be? What do I want my last breath to be? So if you have control of your last breath, which not all of us get, but that's a very important question to ask, because then it allows us to say things like, well, I want to die holding my wife's hand, or I want to die with my husband next to me in bed, or I want to die with my children around me, or I want to die listening to my favorite music, or even if there's a fantasy that, you know, is not likely going to become true, but maybe would, you know, if I have control, I want to have my bed taken out to the ocean and I want to die listening to the sea and smelling the salt air, or I want to die alone. So that question, I think, allows people to be honest within themselves and then share that kind of a conversation with their loved ones. Because I think that kind of a question lets people be honest with themselves and others. Again, our culture has a lot of ideas about what, I want to say, in quotes, a good death is all about. So I want to put that phrase aside only because it exists in the world, but I think it does a lot of disservice. But that kind of an understanding, I think, really helps to understand that what's honest about it. A lot of people want to die alone and are afraid to actually say so and tell loved ones that that's what they want. A lot of people want a loved one holding their hand, and it just scares the heck out of that loved one to hear that kind of a prospect, to be able to give that to somebody in their life. So that question, I think, is really crucial for having honest, transparent, tender conversation about what one wants at the end of life.
For both of you, how do we make decisions when sometimes the medical expertise might be in conflict with sort of Jewish values, or where Jewish values might seem to be at the core of our decision making, but we're not sure even what the best medical approach might be? When we just really don't know, and we find as people of faith that we're in between sort of the Jewish values piece and the medical values piece, how do we combine these things, make decisions with both?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, although there can be a lot of the time that I feel like I have seen this the most be tricky is when, say, there's a family with differences of opinion on how they interpret something or what this means, what the teaching is, or whether this person would have followed that and really wanted it or not. That gets really tough. If I'm having a conversation with one of my patients and they say, my Jewish faith informs me that these are kind of what guides my decision making. Fantastic. I don't want to do anything that feels in violation with what is core to you and important to you. And I have people, who say they get an awful diagnosis and they're like, I want to travel the world. I don't want to be tethered to the cancer center and getting chemo that makes me feel sick. And we all make different choices on that. And I, have total respect for whatever guides someone's decision about, even I think the tricky thing and what I had to come into with the experience in medicine is to say, I for sure might have my own thoughts about what I would do or how I might counsel a loved one in this situation, but I'm not this person. This person is the person who I'm helping to kind of give the medical expertise of what we're looking at. And then what is guiding you in your life and your priorities, and then say, well, then I think that this is, you can think about these two choices if they're not kind of in violation, or you can say, I'd say, this is how I'm gonna help if this treatment doesn't feel right for you. Like, these are the other things we can do.
Nice. Rabbi Weiss, what would you say? We talked earlier about a Jewish conundrum, right? Sometimes there are competing Jewish values that might inform how somebody makes a decision. How do you help people bring the Jewish values into their decision making, along with the doctors and the medical professionals who are also giving advice?
Gosh, I think there are a few principles to pay attention to. Dr. Kinderman actually sort of touched on a few of them. I think that, one of the principles that so many of us are used to in Jewish life around end of life is that in Jewish life, we are neither to prolong life nor hasten death. And medical advancement has really pushed that Jewish value boundary in a lot of ways. For example, if someone goes onto a respirator for a particular purpose, but then doesn't seem to be able to stabilize, then there's a conundrum of taking somebody off a respirator or not, in which case you put the respirator on to not necessarily hasten death, but the respirator staying on actually is preventing death. And so removing a respirator, for example, might be a different reason than why you put the respirator on, because oftentimes a respirator just allows somebody to die, and that's a perfectly correct Jewish perspective to have, rather than sustaining somebody artificially on life. But I think that part of, you can just extend that out in a very concrete way with just kind of building a little bit with what Dr. Kinderman said, which is that it's important to pay attention to the function of hope and what one hopes for. And so I think at the end of life, part of what ends up happening Jewishly is that it's important for hope to shift. So a doctor may say, well, we have this treatment, and depending on what you want in your world, this treatment carries a 10% success rate. So you might hear 10% hope and convert that to 100%. Oh, well, if it's 10% hope, maybe I'm in that 10%. That means I'm 100% going to benefit from this treatment. So that's one function of hope. Another function of hope is, my hope is that my children will know how much I love them. My hope is that my best friends will know how much I learned from them. So part of, I think, the Jewish value task at the end of life is in part understanding the shift of hope, because I know I alluded to sort of, in quotes, a good death and the way our culture kind of promotes what a good death might look like, but I want to offer that in many ways, what we might think of as a good death is a death that is reconciled to relationship, that's reconciled to love, that's reconciled to the things that you value, and that when you shift hope, and that allows you to have an end of life that has reconciliation attached to it. Now, I do want to say, I don't mean reconciliation that's forced. Reconciliation is a very, very complex issue, and hope is a very complex issue. So I'm just offering some kind of touchstones for understanding how to understand end of life in a Jewish framework.
So along those lines, I'm sure you both see secrecy and judgment when it comes to decision making in families or with the patient, right? How do you sort of navigate, or how can we navigate away from that so that people can make decisions which are right for them without feeling that there's so much judgment involved in all of these choices or secrecy? How can we have these conversations?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the tricky thing about us as human beings is that, you know, we only barely have control over one person, and that's us, you know? So you may have the best of intentions for your relationship with your sibling or with your child or other people, but they might not be ready for that, you know? So I think that that's the thing kind of around hope, and these are my intentions and things I want to do, and how we could creatively support that if that person isn't ready until they're ready, because I totally agree with that you can't force something when someone, it doesn't go well. But I think about creating opportunities for people to ask questions. I think the thing that I see quite a lot is people saying, I don't want to tell my daughter about the cancer advancing because I don't want her to worry. And it's an instinct of protection and care. But I will say that, for 12 years, I worked at San Francisco General, and it's a trauma center. And it's really tough when you don't have any opportunity to prepare for someone's end of life, because there's a lot of really rich work that can happen in that period. And it's really hard to get that done in a short period of time for people to do all of that emotional and spiritual work. So I think giving that opening doors and seeing how people respond to them, and being honest and vulnerable about, like, I had this news from my doctor and I'm scared about what it means, or I don't know what it means. And I would say, I hear a lot of times I have to be strong for my mom, or I have to be strong for my daughter, my granddaughter. And, I think that, like, honesty is a beautiful thing to model and to share with those people, to say, you know what, like, this is hard and I'm grieving. Like, I have this, and that's part of life too.
So nice. Rabbi Weiss, how do you help people open those conversations, or families, or friends? I mean, how do you help people to be vulnerable and in those moments?
It's so complex. It depends on the person and all sorts of other things. But I want to say, in that same context, part of the truth is it's just plain old hard to watch someone die. And it's really just plain old hard, in quotes, to let someone die. And it's really just plain old hard, to say, okay, we can stop. Or, okay, we'll figure out a way for you to watch, your favorite movies nonstop, and, eat as much whatever ice cream as you want, and we won't worry about the pill regimen. It's hard because, for the most part, it's hard to lose somebody. I'm not being naive about that, because there's at least one of us in this room who is really relieved to lose somebody. We do have relationships in our lives where we're glad somebody is gone. So I'm not being naive about it, but for the most part, part of our human struggle, as Dr. Kinderman said, is it's hard, just be honest. It's hard to let somebody else make the decision for themselves. And it's hard to move into those realms because a lot of times we're not used to the vocabulary of those conversations, and we're not used to the nature of the relationship of those kinds of relationships. But that's where coming to understand what might be spiritual for you can be cultivating. If you love music and somebody brings music into your deathbed and then you share music together, then that opens up a lot of things that might be opened up in a different way than trying to control a conversation about how well you look and how great you're doing. And isn't it wonderful that you're feeling better today? And is there anything I can get you? Should I remind the nurse to bring you your medications now? All the ways in which we think we're tending to somebody because we're nervous, or because we don't really know what to do, or because it's hard to watch somebody be sick, and it's hard to watch somebody be different than they've been otherwise in life.
A couple of contemporary issues I just want to get your opinions on. Death with dignity, also known as assisted suicide. It's certainly something that we have been dealing with increasingly in this congregation, and I think probably in the city and in the world. What are your thoughts from a medical perspective, from a Jewish perspective? What are some approaches to this?
Yeah, well, so I think that there are at least 10 states where medical aid in dying is legalized and went into effect in California, I believe in 2016. It's called the End of Life Option Act, is the law in California. And it basically allows people who are 18 or older who have a terminal diagnosis. So if two doctors have to agree that if the disease takes its natural course, your life expectancy is 6 months or less. And if you're able to kind of administer the medication yourself, that's the other kind of key. You can't have someone else giving it to you. You can have someone helping you, but you have to be able to take it yourself. Then you're eligible for that. And I think that there've been a lot of, this has been legal in Oregon and Washington for over a decade, and the information that we have from California is very similar to those states in saying that for a lot of people, it really ends up being about control, about saying, I think there are two times of life, the birth and the death process, I feel like have incredible parallels, because, a person who is expecting is walking around with this sort of weird ticking time bomb of like, I don't know when my water's gonna break, I don't know where I'll be or what I'll be doing. You don't know whether it's gonna be a complicated labor. You don't know what that's gonna look like. And we've created all of these structures around the birth process. I don't think it's accidental that people develop a birth plan and they get very upset if they can't get their birth plan, because it's a very inherently out of control, powerful situation. And I feel like we're starting to do that more in the end of life space. So I don't know, some of you may have heard there are end of life doulas now who people can hire to accompany them in this time of life and help prepare and be present as someone is approaching the end. But I think that uncertainty for a lot of people is kind of more, because it's an unknown. None of us have been through that who are in this room. And so to say, if it gets to be feeling like it's more than I can handle, I want to know that I have a way out. So that for people who don't choose to go down that path, there are ways that I, as a palliative care doctor, as hospice physicians or teams, could help ease suffering, even for people like who have very significant pain or other things short of kind of taking this medication to end your life. And when someone asks me questions about that option, I usually walk through that with them just to say that this isn't your only out or your only option. There are other things that we can do to help support you at the end of life.
Rabbi?
Oh my gosh. I think Gosh, is it okay to say we all recognize how complex and layered this is? And, I can't possibly, I'm not in a moment gonna touch on all the places, but I guess what I like to say is that the secrecy in that framework, I think is not healthy. I think that there's a lot of issues that Dr. Kinderman touched on, and we all know that have to do with control and with hoping that we can sort of get, have our last breath in a way that, let's say we want. I think that there's too much secrecy around that particular way in which people make a choice to come to their last breath. And it's not about, I don't know, I think it'd be just really important for people to talk about it more about what is that secrecy and really what is at work there. I think the secrecy isn't healthy. It's not healthy for a spiritual community. It's not healthy for a theological community. It's not healthy for a Jewish community. It's not healthy, if I can say it this way, it's not healthy for the life of a synagogue and a congregation. That kind of secrecy isn't spiritually healthy. And it can be clumsy and clunky, but I know your rabbi's open to that conversation, so I just think it's important that it not be a conversation of secrecy. What I also want to say is, at least in my experience, whenever anybody has wanted to talk about that and make that choice, I know many, many people who have along the way. What I want to say is it becomes really important to have honest conversation about pain, about medications and things like that, and to get into the guts of it. Because I think that's where people feel more comfortable to talk about what they feel like they can live with or not live with, how they want to live or not live. And that conversation leads to all sorts of other reflections and richness. And that conversation is as individual as the person. But I do want to give you just one question as a tool. This isn't the end all be all, but just as an example for giving language and concept to the conversation. Ask yourself this question and ask a loved one in the moment that you think it's important. If you have a choice to have enough pain medication that keeps you still aware of the people around you, but not completely out of pain, like a mild headache, okay? Or you have the choice to be 100% out of pain, but asleep and not aware. What do you want? Now that question may or may not be answerable, but that gives you an example of a question to ask yourself and other people to get into the guts of what it is that somebody wants to make the decision to take medications to deliberately invoke their last breath.
Great.
It's hard to know where the answer will go. And I am deliberately not making a judgment about what that answer might be, except to say it's really important that this conversation not be secretive.
And I think the thing that I would add in kind of accompanying people in that process is to be honest with yourself around if there is an unsettledness in your spirit about whether this is right or not. I think that kind of to Rabbi Weiss's point around kind of the spiritual work of end of life, I just think that that is really fraught. I've had patients who are like, I don't know whether this changes where I end up on the other side of death, for whatever tradition or what that means. And I feel like that's a tricky way to kind of be experiencing your last moments and weeks. And so, the other thing I would say to this kind of in our point about conversations with your loved ones if they have a lot of hesitation around it, I think that that's something to pay attention to too. It ultimately is always your choice, but the people who survive you are the ones who live with that for potentially decades. So I just think those are considerations I would put in the mix if you're, in that place of considering it.
So
Can
on
I
this
say,
topic-
Rabbi Graf, something else? I think if I can say this in our liberal Jewish Reform world, if I can kind of be really specific about it, I think
Yes.
some of these topics like end of life choices, like a lot of people in the Jewish community saw this law as very important. And so they were part of the lobbying effort and they were part of the letter writing effort and good things, because in our Reformed Jewish movement, we are social action oriented and we want to see the world be a better place. And that law exists is different from how individual people come to that decision in their own lives. So those kinds of things are different. So what I want to say, just to kind of be really blunt and maybe a little cute about it, but really clear, is death, those kinds of things in death is not a social action project. Questions about whether or not we want that law to exist is a perfectly wonderful, important civil, civic, maybe even spiritual and religious question to put forward, to have as a law of the land in a country that separates church and state. And we may have worked on that, but death in and of itself is not a social action project. So we might take a stand about a green death. We might, or burial, or composting, or all sorts of other things in the world about dying and death. But I think that the core part of, the spiritual narrative piece is death is not a social action project. It's much more tender and serious and worthy of conversation. And I think too often, if I can say it this way, we take on that kind of a social action project and it actually keeps us, it has a certain kind of secrecy attached to it. It keeps us from getting into the more important relational aspects that are important to talk about with your rabbi or with your loved ones or in your congregation, or to make your congregation healthy when it comes to dying.
Well, to both of your points, I will say that in our congregation here, we've had a number of people who have made all kinds of choices, every choice you can imagine. And people always offer to talk to others who are contemplating some of these choices. So not only can the conversation take place with loved ones, with the clergy, but also there are other people to help just guide and to explore all of these topics with. One last question I want to ask you both as caregivers who spend so much time helping people die or navigate the end of life. How do you each take care of your own spiritual, mental, emotional well-being so that you're not sort of in this place of death all the time, even though, you are?
Yeah, I personally feel like that it's sort of like the question of finding work-life balance, like in that it's not, oh, I found it, I'm at the perfect balance point. It's a dynamic thing.
I was gonna say, let me know, whatever that is. I'd love to know.
I have some bad news. There is no perfect key to that, but so I think that as I've come to accept that it actually loosens things to say, like, I had a really hard month where a lot of patients died. And so, like, what do I need extra to take care of myself in that moment? Or I had a really hard conversation with a patient or a family or that sort of thing, and feel like I'm learning in that space. I feel like during the pandemic, exercise is really important for me, and the pandemic forced me to do that outdoors a lot. And so I think being in fresh air and nature.
Sorry, keep going.
sorry, is key. I watch a lot of stand-up comedy. I have found I have let go of the idea that I need to be sophisticated in the books that I read. I tend to read things that have happy endings that are really predictable. And I have a good therapist, and I have a church community that, again, friends and people that I can talk to. So it's not any one thing. I think it's important to have a lot of different tools.
Nice. Rabbi Weiss, how do you maintain some balance?
Just to add on to what Dr. Kinderman said, I personally, just the way I'm knit, I have just an endless fascination with people's spiritual experience and what they do with it. And I just feel honored by being let into that world, and feel inherently nurtured by it. I myself have a tremendous spiritual attraction to nature and the water and the sea and swimming and things like that, even though here I am in Palm Springs, but I live in a place that has 7 swimming pools and I love to swim. So I have to say that just because of the way you asked the question, Rabbi Graf, is that on a personal level, actually retired from the healing center, not at all feeling burned out. I feel just endlessly enriched by the experience, and oddly, in some ways, even more confident than when I began because of the experience of it all. So I think that part of the key is cultivating one's own spiritual life and theological life, and the capacity to cultivate relationship to transcendence, and taking leaps of faith and exploring one's own landscape of awe. So that just adds to the conversation for what from what Dr. Kinderman had said, and any of us who take care of ourselves in different ways. Yeah.
Nice. Well, as people said to me when I lived in Phoenix, it's all beach. So you're at the beach all the time. It just goes for a while. I'd like to turn off the recording.